Hey folks, this is JLove47 back with another video. I played davorkare, who was rated 1,267 on chess.com. I want you to just watch this video, look at the moves I made, and tell me what areas you think I need to improve in. What part of my game do I need to work on? I tried to take control of the 4 center squares. So my first move was to d4. He moved his pawn up to c5, threatening my pawn at d4. I decided not to attack. I just moved up to d5, and then he threatens my pawn by moving his knight to f6. I defended that pawn by moving my knight to c3. He moves his pawn down to e6, once again threatening my pawn there on d5. And I just said forget it. I'll take his pawn on e6, and he takes my pawn. So we trade pawns at the beginning of the game. I move my pawn up to e3. He moved his pawn down to d5. I move my knight out to f3. Once again trying to take control of the 4 center squares of the board. Because I know that if you have control of the 4 center squares of the board, then you have an advantage. Because all attacks go through the center part of the board. So he moves his bishop down to d6. I then threaten his bishop by moving my knight up to b5. He moves his pawn down to a6, threatening my knight. And I decided to trade pieces. I go ahead and take his bishop there at d6. And he takes my knight with his queen, moving his queen down to d6. I move my pawn up to c4. This was kind of like an amateur move, but you know, some people actually fall for tricks like this. I thought that he'd probably take my pawn and then I can go on ahead and take his queen, but he wasn't that stupid. So he moves his knight down to c6. And I go on ahead and take his pawn there on d5, threatening his knight and his pawn there. And we trade pawns again. I then move my knight up to g5. He moves his rook over to f8. I move my bishop up to e2. He threatens my bishop, moving his bishop down to g4. I guess he want to trade bishops. And I decide not to do that. I decide to just protect my bishop by moving my queen up to c2. He takes my bishop anyway. And then I take his bishop with my king, moving my king to e2. He castles. I then move my knight up to h7, threatening his rook and threatening his knight. He decided to trade knights. He takes my knight, and then I take his knight with my queen. Then I take his pawn there on g7. He moves his knight down to d4. I can't take his knight because I can't move into check. And if I move my pawn to d4 and take his knight, then I'll be exposing my king. And I can't do that. It's not allowed. So his knight is safe there. So I move my king up to d3. He takes my pawn on f2 with his rook. And then I take his knight with my pawn. And he doesn't decide to attack my pawn. He decides to move his pawn down to c4 and put me into check. And then I move my king over to c3, getting out of harm's way. He moves his pawn down to b5. He's trying to put me into checkmate right here, as you can see, because he has his rook on the e file and the f file. He has his pawn coming down the b file, and he has his queen right there, so he can kind of get me into a rough situation right there, kind of scary situation. Kind of looks like it could be possibly a checkmate in a couple moves. If I didn't make the right moves from here on, I would have got checkmated. So So I moved my queen down and put him into check. I was tired of being on the defensive, so I got a little scared, a little nervous. First thing I thought to do was to just move my queen down and put him into check to try to think of another move. But for the meantime, I just wanted to put him into check so he can get off my back, because he was really going in for the kill there, I see. So I had to do something. So he protects his king with his rook. I didn't move my pawn up because I knew eventually he was going to move that queen down, or even move the pawn down and put me into check. And if he had to move the pawn down there on B5, then he would have put me in check, and it would have been nowhere for me to go. I think that would have been checkmate. Yep, it would have been checkmate, I believe. All he had to do was move that pawn there on B5 down to B4, and it would have been checkmate, I believe, if I'm looking at it correctly. So that's why I moved my pawn up to C4. Then he moves his rook. He moves his rook up to F4, threatening my queen. I guess he didn't see my bishop there. So I took the bishop, and that was the deciding factor of the game. Making mistakes like that. He played well up until that point, but when he made that mistake, it was pretty much over. And I pretty much dominated him from there. He really messed up. He moves his queen up to E7, and I threaten his queen. He can't take my bishop because my queen is there protecting him. And then I decided to get my rook involved. He couldn't move his rook and attack my rook because my rook was there protecting him. My rook there on A1, and also he couldn't move into check. His rook was the only piece protecting his king, and he's seen that, so that's why he moved his king down to B7. I decided to take his rook. His queen cannot take my rook because my queen is there protecting it, and because he's down material, the last thing he want to lose is his queen, but he eventually went on to lose it anyway. He moved his queen up to F8. I then put him in check with my rook, moving my rook up to E7. Once again, he cannot take the rook with his queen because I have my bishop there on G5 protecting it. Then I put him into check again with my bishop. And he can't take my rook up there on E7. Is that E7? I believe that's E7. He can't take my rook up there on E7 because he's in check now. He moves his king over to A8. I move my queen up to D7. And he takes my bishop, but it really doesn't matter at this point because the game is over. I move my rook up to E8. His only move was to protect his king with his queen to B8. And he takes my rook with his king. I move my other rook over to F1. He moves his king back into the A8 corner. And I go in for the kill, moving my rook up to F8. That's checkmate. He was a pretty good player, and even though he was rated higher than me, I think I was the stronger player. I think I had more skills than him, I can say. I would like to think so. And the best man won, the better player won, stronger player. So I want you guys to basically analyze my game and tell me what areas do I need to improve in, what mistakes did I make, and just give me some advice. I'm trying to become a better chess player. You know, I don't have no problem with anybody giving me any advice. I'm willing to learn because that's the only way I'm going to get better. So, thanks a lot for watching. I'll be back with more videos in the future. Peace.